Okay, thank you very much. So we changed the topic slightly, and now we'll address how to behave in confronting authorities, especially from the perspective of lay people. And let me, does it work? No, it doesn't work. Why doesn't it work?
Do you want to borrow my one?
But it just worked, right?
Yeah.
So, wait a moment.
Yeah.
It made some noise.
Should we just try this one here? Since it worked?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So I'm not used to this device. Sorry for that. So okay. So we start with a well-established and probably known to all of you definition of post-truth. So I start with post-truth, not with fake news, in the Oxford Dictionary, and it said in 2016, post-truth is relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal beliefs. And to understand this correctly, I think the term facts can drop out here. It's more like being sensitive to evidence that's important. So our beliefs are not sensitive to evidence any longer when we are in this kind of post-truth situation. And of course, well-known results of this kind of post-truth situations are conspiracy thinking, distrust in experts, and bullshitting. And you might ask yourself, and I think this topic will come up again and again, whether post-truth situations increased over time. And so there's interesting evidence from two social psychologists, Ushinsky and Parent, who wrote a book on the American conspiracy theory in 2014, and they had a lot of data by letters to the editors of the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune, namely 100,000, and they just checked how much content was related to conspiracies in those letters. And it turned out, so now I have to see whether I can do something with a laser pointer. Here, this is, yeah. It turned out, I mean, this starts, I don't know whether you can read it, it's 1890 and it goes up to 2010. And so there were two heights, so late 19th century and just after the Second World War. But in general, the tendency is going down, as you can see here, right? Yeah. And so this is a little bit of surprise because the invention of the internet did not change a lot. I mean, you might say the evidential basis is weak, right? Because it's only letters to the editors, and it's 100,000, but it's in some sense a small basis still, because there might be other evidences around which were not reflected in that survey. But still, it's maybe gives you pause in thinking that conspiracy thinking is increasing enormously over time. Okay. So there are a lot of different explanatory factors, I think, in explaining how post-truth situations come about. And we have talked and will talk about many of those. And just to give you a sketch of what will not be talking about in the rest of the paper. So you might, of course, go back to resources of fake news as instruments of propaganda and manipulation, which make then people think or having beliefs which are not in line with the evidence available. We have talked about psychological biases, all kinds of different ones. Then there are social factors like polarization, partisanship. Technologies play a role, also institutions. So this ranges from the internet up to all kinds of media, but then also practices of journalism. We just talked about this kind of objectivity standard or neutrality standard. And then you might think that also there are some kind of dominant ideologies as postmodernism, which creates a kind of anything goes attitude. And there's another one, namely the question whether unrestricted critical thinking and kind of false ideals, false democratic ideals, and false ideals of epistemic equality might also create and play some role in the tendency towards post-truth. I mean, that's probably controversial, we will see later, and maybe a little bit provocative, but I will show you that there is some crucial insight behind that this plays at least some role. Okay, so let me start with giving you an outline of a few basic concepts I will later on use. And the first one is epistemic authority. And epistemic authorities, as I understand them, are people who are epistemically superior to us, means they are more trustworthy, they are more reliable in their judgment. And epistemic authority is always a concept, a term which covers a relative relation between the person who is superior and the recipient who is not, or who is inferior in relation to that authority. Keep in mind that authorities are always authorities within a domain. It's sometimes hard to cover what exactly is in the domain. It sounds as if you are talking about a bunch of objects, right? We'll later see that it more depends on the methods used. But it's in any case restricted to a domain. And of course, what plays a major role here is that the authorities have, in some sense, a more comprehensive body of evidence as the layperson, the recipient, and that they also have better skills in evaluating the evidence which is available to them. So, later cases would be expert mathematicians. I mean, it's clear what, in a way, has to be calculated, but they have good skills in doing that. Or the ornithologist, I mean, there's a visible bird, right? But some have the good skills to see the relevant features, to say and to classify what kind of bird it is. So I turn this now into kind of definition. I know definitions are a tricky issue, but let me still try. So I will treat an authority in the following way. A is an epistemic authority for some subject S with respect to some domain D, if and only if S has justification to believe that A is an expert about D, and A is an epistemic superior to S with respect to that domain. And that means, as I already said and elucidated, has superior reasoning competences and very likely has considered all of S's evidence, probably much more, right? So it's more inclusive in the evidence than what S has already considered. So what is important about it is, I mean, as I said, it's relative, it's domain specific, and authorities are recognized authorities. So nobody can be an authority without anybody recognizing him or her as an authority. Experts can be unrecognized, but authorities cannot. So what is the role of, or what are the roles of epistemic authorities in our society? Of course, they compensate ignorance, that's clear, but they also allow us to calibrate our judgment on issues we have our own judgment on, right? I mean, the first thing is just we get information from an eyewitness about things we did not see ourselves, so there was no reasons, no evidence for us available before. The second thing is we have already evidence about some domain, and we do our, kind of reasoning about this domain, but the expert is better, and so we can calibrate our judgment with respect to this authority. So now let me shift over to two principles I find widely shared and I will in part attack. And these are the principles you all know from the Enlightenment tradition, for example. So the first one I call the principle of Enlightenment. And my take on that is the following, and I will relate this shortly to Kant and other people, but here is my take on it. So the principle says, whenever you rationally consider the truth of some proposition P, you must never stop using your own reasons for this specific proposition. I mean, you cannot stop thinking or reasoning in general, right? I mean, that would be giving up rationality. The question here is whether you use still your reasoning about the specific proposition in question. So in Kant, in a way, although he doesn't say the same thing, has this in mind, I guess, in his famous article on what is enlightenment. So he says, have the courage to use your own understanding without another guidance, and he probably would like to add on any subject. And here's Michael Lynch in his book on the Internet of Us from 2016. When, for example, we aren't an expert on something ourselves, we seek advice from those who say they are. But if we are wise, we also get evidence that of that person's expertise, references, degrees, or word of mouth. Moreover, and that's now the important part of the passage, we look for them to explain their opinions to us in ways that make sense given what we know. So what is required here is not only that we have credentials of expertise and authority, but we also relate what they tell us to our knowledge in the domain. I mean, that's the only way I can make sense of this last part here, right? I mean, so it should make sense given of what we know about the domain, of course, I mean, not about something else. So he's clearly endorsing that principle. There's also a different principle, that's now the principle related to equality and democratic reasoning. So I call it the principle of democratic reason. So it claims, whenever you rationally consider the truth of some proposition P, you must not exclude, marginalize, or silence any rational thinker's reasoning, including your own, about P. So it's in a way, you can say, a special case, a more general case than the principle of Enlightenment, because there you were required to use your own reasoning about P, and here nobody's reasoning about P should be excluded or marginalized, right? So it's a more general case. And I think Habermas is endorsing that principle on many places, so I just took something from his elucidations of the discourse ethics from the 90s. So he says, no one can honestly join a discussion if she does not presuppose the context of discourse in which public access, equal participation are at least in principle guaranteed. The participants can aim at convincing each other only if they pragmatically implicate that the acceptance or denial is determined by nothing but the force of the better argument. So there's equality, equal participation, part of it, and in the end of it, everybody should be led in thinking by the arguments and the reasons given to them. Okay. So here it seems that this principle requires some kind of symmetry between or among different rational thinkers. Everybody's included, everybody's on equal footage, on eye level, and of course it excludes authorities to dictate what one ought to believe in the relevant domain, it seems. So let me just make a few reflections on the relation between those two principles. As I said before, it seems as if this principle of democratic reason in a way entails the other principle of enlightenment, because as I said before, the principle of democratic reason says nobody should exclude it in his or her reasoning about P, and that means you yourself, nobody. From a first person point of view, nobody should be excluded. Even I myself should not be excluded from thinking about P in the face of anything. So it seems that the principle of enlightenment is a special case of the principle of democratic reasoning. Now this was the wrong way. It seems that those principles, even the stronger one, the general one, are widely accepted in our modern societies. And especially the principle of democratic reason does exclude nobody from using her or his own reasoning capacities about the proposition P. In a way, this rules out ungrounded deference to authorities, right? You should not blindly go with the view of the authority. You should always reason and think about the issue at matter on the basis of what your reasoning is available, what kind of reasons are available to you. You can also take into account what the expert says. You can give high weight to that, but you should never ever give up your own thinking about the issue. In And of course, a special case of this later thing would be that you always also critical check authorities against what you yourself think about the issue in question. And that might lead to the conclusion that in cases of outrageous beliefs of authorities, you just demote or reject the person as an authority. So if some authority comes up with a crazy view, I come later to examples, then on the basis of that very insight you might say, okay, it's not, she is not, or he is not an authority any longer. I can see on the basis of my own reasoning that she's not. Okay, so this is just introduction, just the foundations, and now my claims will be the following, and I hope to get to this, all of this. The first one is that I think that the principle of democratic reason and the principle of enlightenment are both in conflict with what is required from a purely epistemic point of view. I then will show you that the principle of democratic reason can also have dangerous consequences with respect to promoting conspiracy thinking in some cases, and at least also give reason to erosion of trust in authorities. And then I will come up with an alternative view, the preemption view, and I will show you that this restricts the scope of critical reasoning and democratic reason in plausible and fruitful ways. So that's the program. Okay. And this is the steps. These are the steps. So I'll first show you what is wrong about the principle of democratic reason from a purely epistemic point of view. I then will focus on the epistemic dangers of the principle of democratic reason. And then I will, in a way, address three worries about the modified view, so the view I favor, and will end with some conclusions. So, let us start with the following question. So assume you are a layperson, and there's an authority, and you identify certain beliefs in the authority, let's say the belief that P, but you have evidence yourself about the issue, and maybe you have already a belief of yourself, right, built upon on this matter, and now you can go different lines here in face of this authority belief you identified. You could take the authority simply as an advisor. That means she gives you new reasons, new evidence, and you take in these reasons and evidence and calculate and reason on the basis of those new reasons yourself. So she just helps you with giving you new reasons and new arguments. That's everything. The other extreme would be blind trust. Just go with the authority, wherever this leads to. And then there's middle ground. There's a TEV, that's the total evidence view. And I will explain to you in a minute what this means. And that's a preemption view. I will finally go with this view. And what's interesting is that the first two views, those both, are in line with the principle of democratic reason. I mean, here this is clear with the advisor. Everybody can contribute to public discussion, and everybody makes up his own or her own mind. Second is, I mean, I will show you how this is in line. This is in line also the total evidence view with the principle of democratic reasoning, and these both are not in line with that principle. So I want to argue first that two things are untenable directions. So you should not treat the authority only as an advisor. I give you the argument in a second. And you should not trust authorities blindly. I hope this is something you believe yourself. So why should you reject the pure advisor model? One way, I mean, I think there are many different ways to argue for that, but one way to argue for it is that the pure existence of a belief in the authority, so remember, the authority is someone whom you believe to be superior to you and who has more inclusive evidence. And so the identification or recognition of a belief in the authority is itself evidence for P, higher order evidence for P. Why is that so? I mean, one way to argue for it is this. I mean, you start with a psychological premise, namely that the epistemic authority believes that P about some proposition in D. You add that the beliefs of the authority are most likely true, and then you can just derive from that P is most likely true. So there is a way, over and above the reasons given by the authority, to argue on the basis of identification of authority beliefs towards P. So the authority cannot only be an advisor. And clearly, I mean, blind trust is ruled out because reactions should, in any case, be rational. I mean, that's what I presuppose here, right? We want to have rational reactions to authorities, and blind trust would mean we just trust without any reason. So that's ruled out. So what is now left over, it's no surprise, are these two positions in the middle. They are both more attractive, and I will continue with focusing on those positions. So what is the total evidence view? We have maybe one proponent here among us. I probably will say you're not exactly a total evidence view proponent, but I take you as somebody like that. Jaffa Lecky has recently published on that as well. The idea is that in forming our belief about P, we always consider our first order evidence we have for P, and then in addition we also consider the higher order evidence, right? That we know that the authority has a certain belief about P, and this is evidence which might have heavy weight because we know the authority is an epistemically very good person, an excellent person. So it has high weight, heavy weight, and in many cases this might outweigh our own first order evidence. So we have some reason to believe P, let's assume the authority believes not P. We take her as a very, very excellent reasoner, so this outweighs our prima facie justification for P. She's believing not P, and so on balance, we should then go for not P. I mean, that's the tendency here. And that is, of course, in line with the principle of democratic reason, because our own reasoning, nobody's reasoning, is ruled out from scratch. And here's Lecky's take on it. She thinks that the preemption view is a view where beliefs are formed like rats would form beliefs. So here's the quote for her. We should never aim to form beliefs as the rats do. What I am proposing here is that the testimony of experts should always be regarded as a piece of evidence to be weighed with the other relevant evidence we have on the matter. So there's always weighing, balancing, and sometimes my own reasoning can be outweighed. Okay. So here's the next view, and this was recently defended by Saksepsky. It goes back to some ideas of Joseph Ross. Karen has defended similar things. So here is my reference point, Saksepsky. So she says, when we discover that an authority believes that P, our own reasoning about P is completely preempted, we must not make any further use of our own reasons for P. So this is not in line, of course, with the principle of democratic reason, because some epistemic perspectives, as our own, are excluded, right, by confronting the authority. And here is Saksepsky's position. The fact that the authority has believed P is a reason for me to believe P that replaces my other reasons relevant to believing P, and it's not simply added to them. It's a replacement of reason. So what is wrong with the principle of democratic reason from my perspective? So one way to have a take on that is to start with the track record argument. What's going on from your own perspective when you assume that you're a layperson? You know that the authority has a more reliable judgment on the matter, and she has considered all of your reasons already. Then it's clear that she is more reliable than you yourself. And now, if you give any weight to your own reasoning, the result will be a deviance from what the authority believes. And in following your own judgment, even in part, And making a deviance from the authority's belief would, in a way, result in an inferior track record, because you would deviate from what you take from your perspective to be the better judgment. And so the idea is the general deference to authority is instrumentally the better strategy, because it's a more reliable strategy. At least two objections to this argument, already explicitly made by Jan Falecki, and I just want to discuss those. So she thinks that it might be the case that in the end, the authority gets so much weight that your own reasoning is always outweighed. So it makes, in practice, no difference, right? If you give minimal weight to your own reasoning, and these kind of very heavy weight to the expert views, then on balance, you will always go with the authority. And then, I mean, you need not give up the total evidence view. It's just the question of the quantities of weight given to the positions. Wait a minute. No. The thing is, of course, the weight you give to an authority has to be proportional to her or his epistemic quality, right? I mean, if she is twice as good as you in her judgment, you should not give a weight like that is a quantity of 1,000 or so of your weight. I mean, so it should be proportionate to the epistemic quality, otherwise the account would be completely unmotivated. And so you can just have a matrix here. So this is just illustrating this in an example that you do not get the right results. So we start with the authority who has a weak belief on some proposition P, and let's say she is twice as good as S, so it gets a factor two-thirds, and the result would be, if you calculate this number, then you have S, the layperson, who has a strong disbelief and gets the factor 1/3, and that is the result. And if you add up, you get a weak disbelief. So if you proportion the weight the authority and yourself get in the right way, it will in fact make a difference to the judgment, which sometimes even goes from believing things to disbelieving them, right? And so it still stands, the objection, which cannot be countered by Lecky, that it makes a difference whether you give away to your own reasoning or not in what you believe as a result. So you still end up with some belief which is based, or is in a way epistemically not as good as you would have a belief when you just defer to the authority. That's the first point. Second point is, Lecky thinks that, so she would say, I mean, be serious. Of course, very often we just defer to the authorities, but when it comes to specific cases, and you are sure that you didn't make a mistake and you are certain about a certain proposition, then you should not follow the authority. So follow the authority unless you know something or you're pretty sure about it or certain about it. Isn't that a better strategy? A better strategy which could, at least is not in line with the preemption view and leaves room for taking into account your own reasoning, in certain cases at least. The thing is here that, of course, you have to figure out from your perspective whether you know, and you yourself have to assess whether you're certain or not. And we know from psychology, especially from Kruger and Dunning, that people are really bad in these things if they are incompetent. I don't want to say every layperson is incompetent, but if she or he is less competent, and so the risk is that she or he thinks that things are known or uncertain, although they are clearly false. And when you study the writings of Dunning, then you find also a theory about what happens when you make these kind of metacognitive judgments about whether you know, whether you are certain, and so. And there are some cues for that, namely, do you really have access to explicit reasoning for your judgment? Then you're more certain. is a judgment fluent, or then you feel certain, and does your pre-existing self-view give you confidence in your expertise? And what happens is, with incompetent people, these cues are unreliable. So, right, I mean, even if you have reasons for your view, you might be ignorant of many, many other reasons, and so you do not see that you're on the wrong track. Fluency is not always determined by competence, but very often by recent exposure or by repetition, so it can be just by social circumstances be influenced. And of course, the pre-existing self-view can be grossly misleading. It's really terrible if you see the data Dunning and Kruger put, in a way, highlighted in their original paper. It was like people who had a logical competence such that they were right in their solutions in 10% of the cases. They thought that they would be better than average. And they said that the people who were really well-performing were underperformer. And actually, the reverse is true for the experts. They underestimate their competence, interestingly. Okay. So it seems that, Dunning is here quite explicit that we have cues for knowledge attribution to ourselves and for being confident, but very, very often they are misleading. And so if you apply the rule Lecky suggests, then we are very often off the hook, right? Because we think we know, but as laypersons we often do not, or we are certain, although the judgment is clearly false. So I think both objections against this kind of track record arguments are not good ones. So then there's a second line to defend the preemption view. That's my own take of it. And the idea is, to understand this, and I give you just a very short sketch of it, of the argument, you need the distinction between rebutting and undercutting defeaters. So when you get a rebutting defeater, you have a new piece of evidence that outweighs your prior evidence. But if you get an undercutting defeater, there's a new piece of evidence that makes one's prior evidence for P rationally unusable for P. So when you see something redly, or something appears to you redly, and you get the information that the wall or whatever is illuminated by red light, then you should no longer use your sense impression of being red as a reason for thinking that something is red. It's not outweighed, there's just no evidential weight left to make that judgment. So, and then you can just apply this now to the situation between the layperson and the authority. So what happens here, a layperson recognizes that an authority believes P to a certain degree. Okay, that would mean 40 minutes, right? 40. Okay, so maybe 40
to 45 cents.
So when you receive this kind of testimonial evidence, you get evidence, of course, that bears on the truth of P, but at the same time, I think we learn that someone who is in a superior with respect to competence in the relevant domain and has very likely considered all of your evidence believes P, right? So you get information about what someone who's superior to you believes about the issue, and this constitutes an undercutting defeater from my perspective for assessing P on the basis of her own P-relevant evidence. Why is this so? Because she receives evidence indicating that any deviance from A's degree of belief on the basis of S use of further pre-relevant evidence would render S's belief irrational. We know that this guy has considered all of our evidence and has better judgment. So we think that if we deviate from that evaluation, that will be irrational. And getting information that our own judgment would be irrational is just what constitutes an undercutting defeater. So typically, then we would defer to the authority's belief. Okay. So we have, this argument, of course, in detail would be much longer. in essence, it tells you that facing an authority gives you an undercutting defeater, and that doesn't allow you any longer to use your first order evidence in reasoning, and that explains preemption, exactly what I wanted to have. So we have two arguments, the track record argument and the argument from undercutting defeat, that support the preemption view. So let me now quickly apply this to the case of conspiracy thinking. Remember again, the principle of democratic reasoning said, you should never ever marginalize anybody in reasoning about P. Even you shouldn't even exclude yourself, right, in thinking about P. And that conflicts with the preemption view, because there your own reasoning about P is in a way excluded, and it might lead to conspiracy thinking in the sense that you believe something which is in conflict with what the epistemic authorities believe. And here is an application. You all know about the Twin Towers and 9/11. And the interesting thing about it was that everybody figured out, that the velocity with which the buildings collapsed was as high as freefall, or nearly as high as freefall. You can see it would take 9 seconds for a stone getting down to earth and from top of the building, and the collapse of the building took a little longer time, but was nearly as quick. And people explicitly said what is written here, that it's impossible that this building collapsed just by the planes crashing into that. It must have another and different explanation, namely that there were bombs and explosions at the same time and on different floors, and then the collapse could be explained. The experts say, no, we can simulate the case, and it's exactly what we would predict. But the layperson says, this is completely outrageous from my view. Probably it's cooked up by the experts. How can that be that the building collapsed like, some heavy or whatever, something just going down in free fall. So using your own reasoning capacities leads into this kind of conspiracy theory. I skip this. So the idea was, we have two arguments in favor of the preemption view, which is in tension of the principle of democratic reasoning, and it might, the principle of democratic reason might lead to conspiracy thinking. I could apply this to many other cases, but since I'm running out of time, I won't do that. So we have to restrict this, and you can see this in red here, that you should do all what I said unless you receive authority reasons. Then you should no longer use the reasoning about P as a basis for the final judgment about P. Let me see, so I have to select now something. So I had three worries. As long as, I shouldn't think too long about it, which to choose, but so one worry you might have is that if you go always with the authority, as I recommended, then this would lead, under certain conditions, certain circumstances, even more into conspiracy theory. I think you had something in mind like that. Maybe we can talk about that. So assume that you are in an encapsulated group, and that can be a racist group, can also be cults, sects, and so, or you have a kind of generally corrupt science system, like Nazi biology or so. Then, of course, the indication of authorities tells you to go with them, and since you cannot use your own reasoning capacities to criticize them, you are in a way forced to go with them, right? This sounds kind of worrisome, because it immunizes against criticism here. And I think that is correct, but I don't see any possibility which is legitimate on general standards in epistemology to cure that. I think the only help we have is that we have to change institutions here. There has to be a change then in the institution of this corrupt science, not by all the individual participants, by political movements, or there has to be help that encapsulations are broken up in some sense of the sects so that they have more information, and then the thing will work better. The other thing is, and then I stop, you might say, if everybody goes with the authorities and nobody reasons for himself, then doesn't this undermine itself in the end? Because the authorities have to learn something and have to be or become authorities. If nobody thinks himself, I mean, there will be, in the near future, there will no longer be authorities. So it's a kind of cognitive suicide. Yeah. And I think we have to distinguish here two things. So when we follow authorities, this doesn't mean that we do not care any longer for our own reasoning. We should just not base our judgment on our own reasoning. What we can do, and what we always do when we learn, is in a way simulating judgment from our perspective and see whether these match with the authority judgments. And if we become good in those things, then we have acquired a skill and can take over. And I think this should be appreciated by proponents of the preemption view, that should be elucidated, and I think it's not part of the positions which are on the market now, but it's at least not in conflict with the preemption view. And since I'm running out of time a bit, you know what I claimed, so I need to repeat this. But what we should do is we should make experts, of course, more visible, and we should be concerned about reputation as a good standards for authority, for having good epistemic quality. That's both important, and probably should change something in our epistemic environment to match up to that. Okay, thank you very much.